So thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Diane Carlisle, and I am the Director of Worship here at Epiphany, and also was very, very privileged to travel with 11 other pilgrims in November of 2024 as we went to Alabama on pilgrimage. It was a different kind of pilgrimage than Epiphany usually does. Epiphany usually goes on pilgrimages to sacred places, to the Holy Land, to England, to the cathedrals, and to holy places there. We have a pilgrimage going to Italy where we will visit the sacred places there. So this pilgrimage was a little bit different. And so as I was contemplating this pilgrimage, putting it together with great guidance from Sherilyn Peterson, who you'll hear from in a bit, I had to rethink what a pilgrimage was. And so I have a new definition of a pilgrimage that I think really fits what we're called to do. But first I wanted to share with you who actually went on our trip. If I can get it to go forward. Help. We can do that. Here we are in front of a sacred site that Sue will be talking about later, but that's Neil Peterson, Terry Carlisle, myself, Sherilyn Peterson, Sophie Hager-Hume, Sue Carey, and then over on the other side is Mary Lee Peters, Kat Randolph, Julia Putnam in front of Elizabeth Roberts, Mary Kimball, and Clip Niffen. Not everybody could be here today, so we will hear from those among us that were able to be here. But here's the definition I wanted to share of pilgrimage, and this is from the Living Legacy website. Living Legacy was our partner in this pilgrimage. It wasn't just Epiphany people. There were 38 people who went on this pilgrimage. So a pilgrimage is a ritual journey with a hallowed purpose. Every step along the way has meaning. The pilgrim knows that life-giving challenges will emerge. A pilgrimage is not a vacation. It is a transformational journey during which significant change takes place. New insights are given, deeper understanding is attained, new and old places in the heart are visited, blessings are received, and healing takes place. On return from the pilgrimage, life is seen with different eyes. Nothing will ever be quite the same again. And I think that's a beautiful definition that broadens the view of what a pilgrimage is. And I can honestly say that we came back changed. I want to first introduce my husband who's sleeping. I will not. I will skip him and come back to him. So last night was the Messiah, in case you didn't know, and Terry was singing, so he's probably still in bed. But one of the things that they had us do is they put us in what they called touchstone groups. And touchstone groups were, we had some of the people from Epiphany in each group, because we were quite a large number, and then other people. And so this was the group that Terry was in, and Elizabeth and Mary Kimball were in, as well as other people. And we met around a meal, around our dinner meal, and talked about what we had seen, what we had experienced, and how it impacted us. And we were given a set of questions to talk about. And we really got to know our table mates quite well. And if somebody else wants to talk to that, please, when it's your turn, just add on to it. Kat also is not here, but one of the things that really spoke to her was the singing. And this was in Selma, actually, and we had prepared a song to sing. And, well, not me, I don't sing, but we sang on the bus. We sang a lot. And it really, we sang the songs of the Civil Rights Pilgrimage, and it helped to internalize those their feelings a little bit. I mean, we were not there, and we were not the people that were so affected by the civil rights movement, but the songs really spoke to the struggles and the journeys of the people that were there. And so singing was very, very important to us on the pilgrimage, as well as the people of the times. I skipped you. I talked about touchstone groups.
Okay, good.
So I would like to invite Sophie and Elizabeth to come forward, and we have a video that we'd like to show you that was in the Living Legacy Museum. It's about 4 minutes long, that kind of tells you about the museum itself, but kind of from the beginnings of slavery up to what is kind of going on right now. So hopefully I can get the video to play. So this is inside the Living Legacy Museum.
We believe there's important work that has to be done in this country to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. It's important that we begin to commit to an era of truth and justice, that we tell the truth about our history, that we find the words necessary to understand all of the pain, all of the suffering that was created by 400 years of enslavement, lynching, segregation, and injustice. It begins in Africa, where millions of people were kidnapped, abducted, taken from their homes, taken from their families, chained, forced onto ships where they were displaced forever. Without understanding that legacy, we don't appreciate the harm, the damage, the tragedy that surrounded the founding of this country. We still live in a country where there is this problem of racial inequality, racial injustice, and the narrative that created that problem of racial difference continues to haunt us today. And so this museum is dedicated to helping people understand the journey. We want people to understand the suffering that slavery created. The demographic geography of America was shaped largely by racial terror. A landscape, a legal architecture that codified racial hierarchy continued to shape life in this country. This society, this country, this nation has work to do to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. At the Legacy Museum, we believe an important experience awaits each and every person, that there is a journey that must be taken to create a different kind of future. It is hard to confront these painful truths, but the powerful thing is that when we have the courage to learn the truth, we open up doors that permit justice, that permit reckoning, that permit healing. This museum is dedicated to creating a society where the children of our children are no longer burdened by the legacy of slavery, no longer presumed dangerous and guilty, no longer haunted by racial inequality no matter where they go. But to get to that society, we all have a role to play. And that's why we want you to come to Montgomery and not just see the sights, but to hear the sounds, to experience the spirit of the people who lived here, who have fought here, who have worked here, and to take that spirit with you out into the world where you can do the same. You can continue to find ways to advance justice in your society, your community, your neighborhood.
Thank you, Diane. And I would just like to echo a few things that have already been said. A tremendous amount of thanks to Diane for all the coordination and Epiphany Parish pulling this together. But without Sherilyn Peterson really driving for this, I'm not sure that this would have come to fruition. It had just came together in such an amazing way, and I feel so blessed to have been able to participate. I also have been on other pilgrimages with Epiphany, and this, as Diane said, was incredibly different than a pilgrimage to Jerusalem or some of these walking pilgrimages that we've had the opportunity to do, and in some ways quite a bit harder. This subject matter, these extraordinary places, and I hope Kat has an opportunity to come up and talk about the singing, so if I can backtrack a moment for even just that element of our time together as a communal, as a group of Epiphany parishioners, alongside of these 32 other, some number other lovely, wonderful participants singing together is such a powerful thing, like the choir knows, like we may have experienced listening to the Messiah when we join in, being able to join in a flow of this historic history that we have, not to live it, but to try to understand it and hold it, and I'm going to use a word, metabolize. For me, this was the most difficult thing to do. We had so much information and these amazing, extraordinary places that we went to, and among this museum system, there are 3 different venues. One is a sculpture park that was just recently opened that Sherilyn had the opportunity to go to, where there might have been more of an opportunity to walk and be contemplative. And then at the Legacy Museum, I'll just share with you, one is confronted with such beauty of positioning of these horrific scenes over and over and over again. And it's undeniable, and I'm relatively visually oriented to have this just flow. So the music in your ears as you're traveling from place to place, hopping off the bus, going into these amazing places, and flowing through these journeys was profound. And I will yield my time a little bit, but I do want to say that with Sue Carey and others probably from our group, we're a way for me to help bring it back, to share, metabolize, and hold on to. This experience is through this Common Power group that is part of the Living Legacy pilgrimage that we went on, and it was founded by a few people here in Seattle, and the previous executive director was David Domke, who had been a University of Washington professor. So there's a hope and a potential opportunity to bring some information through David that can just help us even more live into and learn about and come around these experiences. It was profound, and I hope that everybody has an opportunity to more fully go to these websites and to open your hearts and minds and maybe take in information in a way that might be completely different, maybe closing your eyes, listening to the music. It's really powerful. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about the Legacy Museum, and I wanted to just mention something that I thought of when you were speaking about the idea of pilgrimage. When I came back, I felt unsettled for at least a week. It was really hard to just be part of normal life, having been through this experience. It was so powerful, and it sort of still lingers in my mind. And so I think the words that you read are really important. In the video, you saw Brian Stevenson. Many of you may know him. He is a lawyer, a graduate of Yale Law School, and has dedicated himself and started an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative. And they are focused on getting out of prison people that have been unjustly incarcerated, particularly people of color. And some of you may have read his book, Just Mercy. He's the sort of the person behind the museum and also behind the this justice moment. Oh, could we go back one, please? Sorry. So I wanted to talk first on behalf of Mary Kimball. Unfortunately, Mary's ill and she can't be with us today. But I wanted to mention, outside of the museum, I was really struck by this when we drove up. It says the Legacy Museum in huge letters, and then it says, from slavery to mass incarceration. And that's a critical message that's being delivered here, which is that we may not have slavery anymore, or at least chattel slavery. There might be other kinds of slavery in the world. But what we have today is something very similar, which is people being incarcerated. And so this is at the beginning of the museum. This is a sculpture. As you can see, those heads in the ground are in sand. And you walk through this experience. It's pretty big. I would say it's almost from here to maybe where that sign is. And you are surrounded. You're sort of in this, you feel like you're coming off the ship. There's the feeling of water below you. And to your left and right are these faces, all of which are done by this artist who's from Ghana. And I wanted to share with you Mary's experience with this. She thought that this was extremely powerful and visceral. I think we all would agree. The middle photo depicts the heads and chests of women, men, children, babies, some in metal chains and neck braces. They are arranged on either side of the large gallery room on the ground, and the walls behind them on either side of the gallery show a video and audio of crashing Atlantic Ocean waves, which is what you also saw in that video. This symbolizes the transport of 12 million individuals abducted in Africa, and the 2 million, just listen to these numbers, 12 million were trafficked, 2 million perished along the way. On the right side is an image of a child. I think those are particularly hard to see, that, you know, children were part of this horrible situation. And also, as we all probably know from history, were taken from their parents. The sculptures on the left, all of these are actually made, and this is the artist, Kwame Akoto Bamfo. There was a video of him, which I had a chance to watch as well. And he talks about the journey of these sculptures from Africa prior to their being installed in the museum. He says they traveled from his studio in Ghana to a field near his great-grandmother's home in Ghana. And you hear a translation, this is in the video, of her sharing stories about the abduction of her ancestors. What struck me in the video is, think how many generations past this is, and yet these elders sat there on the ground and tears streamed down their faces, because it's still a raw part of their history. If there's such a thing as trauma that we carry with us, you could see it in those images. The sculptures then took another journey in Ghana to what is called Cape Coast Castle, a fort where those abducted were held in dungeons prior to the journey across the Atlantic, as a memorial to their last time in Africa. Lastly, the sculptures were installed in a lobby area of the Alabama State Capitol building, which is pretty ironic because in the front of the Capitol building in Montgomery is a huge statue of Jefferson Davis. So the South is an interesting place. You know, it's still fraught with images and so forth of the past. I think another comment she just wanted to mention was that there's another sculpture of slaves. Do we have an image of that later? There's a statue of slaves at the Equal Justice Initiative site in Montgomery, which is called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And it memorializes over 4,400 individuals lynched in the U.S. And he also created that statue. It's an image of people, African slaves, in various movements, and they're all connected in a circle. Oh, okay, you'll see it when we get there. But that memorial, you may have seen pictures of it. There are big metal posts, or I guess they're iron, Corten steel, I think I heard from Kat last time, that are hanging from a roof. And as you walk through, you start with them sort of at your height, and then as you start to go down, you move downward, and these things are ahead of you. So effectively, they look like people being lynched. And each of these posts has the names of a town or a place and who in that community was lynched. And this is done with extreme scrutiny and care by the Equal Justice Initiative to research people, and they continue to discover more people. So the 4,400 people that are memorialized is by no means a complete number. So could we go to the next slide, please? I wanted to talk with what I thought of as a coda to this. So this is at the beginning of the museum is the slavery, and toward the end of the museum is the point that I made earlier about incarceration, that this is sort of modern day slavery in the United States. Many of you may be familiar with the book Michelle Alexander wrote. It was published in 2010, and it's called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. 2 years after Obama's election, Michelle Alexander put the entire criminal justice system on trial, exposing racial discrimination from lawmaking to policing to the denial of voting rights to ex-prisoners. Of course, many of this we see today. Brian Stevenson put it this way about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration has had a devastating impact on all Americans, but it's been particularly devastating to the poor and people of color. Black men are 6 times more likely to go to prison for committing the same offenses that white people commit. So to confront that, this is Brian speaking, we've got to do something about these basic inequalities in American society. Inequality is racism. That's a super powerful statement, I think. Inequality is exploitation of the poor. Inequality is abuse of power. So the reason I have these two images is these are two installations within the section on mass incarceration. On the left is an image of a boy, 14 years old. In the museum, they have a larger-than-life photograph of him. He was a 90-pound black 14-year-old boy who was executed by the state of South Carolina in 1944 for allegedly murdering 2 girls. He had been arrested and subjected to hours of interrogation without his parents or an attorney. He faced a sham trial virtually alone. No African Americans were allowed in the courthouse. His court-appointed attorney did not call a single witness. An all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes before convicting him of murder, and the judge sentenced the 14-year-old to death. Despite appeals from black advocacy groups, the governor refused to intervene, and the boy's name is George Stinney, Jr. He remains the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. 70 years later, in 2014, a South Carolina judge held a 2-day hearing, including testimony from 3 of George's surviving siblings, members of the search party, and several experts. The state argued, and this is the most shocking thing of all, the state argued at the hearing that despite all the unfairness in this case, George's conviction should stand. And we see this today, right? We see this in executions that are happening in our time. The trial court disagreed, fortunately, and vacated the conviction, finding that George Stinney was fundamentally deprived of due process throughout the proceedings against him. And in conclusion, he stated, "I can think of no greater injustice." Next to the photo in the museum is a tag that states that Stinney was too small for the electric chair and was restrained by his arms, legs, and body to the chair. When I was looking this up to prepare for today, in Wikipedia, they noted that he was seated on a Bible because he was too short. Not sure if that's true, but that's what they said. The other part of this exhibition on mass incarceration is experiential, and I don't know if you caught it in the video, but what it is rows of seats, and in front of you are holograms of people that were actually exonerated by the Equal Justice Initiative. And you sit down on a bench, and in front of you, it looks like you're sitting in a jailhouse, and you're speaking to the prisoner. And you pick up a phone, and on the other side, the hologram image picks up a phone, and they tell you their story about why they are incarcerated. I have to tell you, for all of those who also did this, it was hard. It was really hard. You do the first one, and you just kind of catch your breath. There must have been maybe a dozen of them, and you could go and sit. I think I got through 3 of them. That, too, is extremely difficult because of the fact that these were so unjust. In most cases, their imprisonment was unjust. I just want to say at the end of my presentation is that the fact that mass incarceration is in the museum is so important because it, as I said earlier, describes injustice today. I wanted to mention that in 2024, our country, our year, the Prison Policy Initiative published a report entitled "Mass Incarceration, the Whole Pie," which shows how broken our criminal justice system remains. According to their research, just listen to these statistics, the U.S. doesn't have one criminal legal system. Instead, we have thousands of federal, state, local, and tribal systems. Together, these systems hold over 1.9 million people in over 1,500 state prisons, about 100 federal prisons, about 3,000 local jails, and about 1,500 juvenile correctional facilities. 140 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian country jails, as well as in military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in the U.S. territories, all at a system-wide cost of at least $182 billion each year. I recommend that you look at the pictures online of the museum, and if you can ever go to Montgomery, I highly recommend it. I know who's next.
I'm reporting on. I'm reporting on Martin Luther King Jr.'s parsonage in Montgomery, but first I wanted to make one comment on the music slide, and that is that we were privileged to have a person, a musician, educator, completely devoted to teaching us songs and being with us the whole time. She wasn't a tour leader or to give us any information about the tour. We had at least 2 other people doing that, but she was there solely to provide musical experience. So Martin Luther King began his civil rights journey in Montgomery. For me, visiting the parsonage where he lived made that history immediate and personal. Let me give you some context of Dr. King's early days in Montgomery. In December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, which sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted 13 months. It was the first large-scale protest for civil rights in the U.S. and demonstrated the power of nonviolent protest to challenge racial segregation. During the boycott, African Americans refused to ride the buses and instead carpooled or walked to work. The bus company lost between 30 to 40,000 fares each day because at that time, African Americans made up about 45% of the population. The company suffered heavy losses and the city became desperate to end the boycott. But the boycott only ended when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1956 that segregated transportation was unlawful. The boycott time was dangerous and violent for Dr. King and all African Americans in Montgomery. Dr. King had just the year prior become the pastor of Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church at the age of 26, his first pastorship after graduating seminary. He became president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which coordinated the boycott. Dr. King was a relatively new pastor. He was young. He received constant death threats for his work, and this was uncharted territory. So he lived in the parsonage with Coretta and their new baby. The parsonage actually was not next to the church because blacks couldn't live next to the church. So it was some distance away. We were allowed in every room, which I thought was pretty astonishing. Much of the furnishings were exactly the same furnishings as when the Kings were there, and those that weren't matched the period. And I felt history in every room. For example, the dining room served as Dr. King's conference room for civil rights strategy and planning meetings. His office, of course, he did a lot of his work there. Can you do the next slide? But what really impacted me the most, actually, was the kitchen. Is it after? Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. A pretty small room and, furnished modestly. There on January 27, 1956, following a late-night death threat, Dr. King struggled mightily to reconcile his fear with his desire for justice. He prayed, and he prayed, and he prayed that night, and he finally found peace and courage in the kitchen that night. A bomb blew up on his front porch 3 days later. You can still see the scar on the floorboards. There's an indentation. Miraculously, no one was hurt that day. And now I'd like you to hear from Dr. King describing that evening.
But I never will forget one night very late. It was around midnight. And you can have some strange experiences at midnight. The telephone started ringing and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. That voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're gonna blow your brains out and blow up your house." I'd heard these things before, but for some reason that night it got to me. I turned over and I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. I was frustrated, bewildered. And then I got up and went back to the kitchen and I started warming some coffee, thinking that coffee would give me a little relief. And then I started thinking about many things. I pulled back on the theology and philosophy that I had just studied in the universities, trying to give philosophical and theological reasons for the existence and the reality of sin and evil. But the answer didn't quite come there. I sat there and thought about a beautiful little daughter who had just been born about a month earlier. We have 4 children now, but we only had 1 then. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in night after night and see that little gentle smile. And I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken away from any minute. And I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was over there asleep. She could be taken from me, I could be taken from her. And I got to the point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. And something said to me, "You can't call on Daddy now. He's up in Atlanta 175 miles away. You can't even call on Mama now. You got to call on that something and that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way." I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. Oh, yes, I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But, Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even unto the end of the world."
Good morning, everybody. As you can tell from presentations thus far, it's a very, very, very moving experience. I wanted to give you a personal experience that I had at the time of these marches in the South, this period from, and one of the things that was very helpful to me was to get the chronology of these events. So truly, this started the beginning of the civil rights peaceful marches and protests was with Rosa Parks' boycott in 1955, and then it truly extended from what we saw with the Selma March, which was 10 years later in March of 65. So that's 55 to 65. Now, I personally was able to go to the March on Washington, a different march, and I need to say a little bit more about that, from the Selma March. And I was a 20-year-old kid at that time and took a bus from Connecticut down to Washington, D.C., and participated in the March on Washington, which is a well-known march. But it's important to keep in mind that the Selma March was a completely different march, so don't confuse the Selma March with the March on Washington. And so one of the things that was very, very interesting to me in my experience was just, so when I went on the March on Washington, which was in August of 63, it was completely peaceful. It was almost a love-in. So you had 1/4, 1/3 white, the rest black. We were singing songs, we were holding hands, we were marching. Of course, we heard Martin Luther King's very, very famous speech, peace at last, and we will all be eating together, and black and white will be equal, and those kinds of words. It was a very, very, very moving and forceful speech. One of the things about that speech was most interesting that isn't usually quoted. At the beginning of the speech, Martin Luther King says, we've been given a check, and the check is bounced. We were given a promise. The promise has not been held to. We are looking to get that check honored. And that was a very, very, very powerful part of that speech. But it was completely peaceful. And so one of the things that struck me during this pilgrimage is that I said, in the series of events from 55 to 65, where did the March on Washington fit in? Well, it was in 1963. And I thought, well, it was a very peaceful march. How did that fit in with all the events we saw in Alabama? It was completely different. And one of the things that really struck me, and one of the things that we haven't talked about this yet, but most people are aware of the fact that there was a Baptist church in Birmingham that we went to about our second day, where 4 black girls were killed by Klansmen. And that was one of the things that became very, very apparent through this thing. The Klan, Ku Klux Klan, was everywhere in a quiet way, but it's threatening. It was its presence, you could feel it in all these things. And so one of the things that really struck me was that, so the March on Washington was on August 28th, 1963. Exactly only 18 days later, those 4 girls were killed. So if you had ever had an impression that things were peaceful and things were really improving, obviously that was a complete misrepresentation of what was going on. The March on Washington was very, very peaceful, but it did not in any way represent what was happening in Alabama and in Mississippi. So it was very, very, very powerful to see that. Then, just to complete this short statement, when we haven't talked about this yet, but our final day on this tour, so we started in Birmingham, we went down to Montgomery, we saw the museum, the Legacy Museum, we saw the museum where it showed the lynchings. Then we went to a Rosa Parks Museum. And Rosa Parks is really the one that started all this with the peaceful protest. And it's interesting that Rosa Parks was basically on a Thursday, I think it was a Thursday, that she said, I'm not going to get from this bus. And the next day, they took her to the courthouse. She was going to challenge the law, which called for segregated busing. 4 days later, on Monday, the bus boycott starts. So the African American community in Montgomery was well prepared for this, and they sent out flyers throughout their churches, And that day, 4 days later, was the start of the 1 year long or 13-month-long bus boycott that really brought about the passage of law at the federal government for the elimination of segregated busing. Remarkable organization and thinking that went into all that. But then the final day was the Selma March, which most people have heard about because there was a movie about it, whenever that was, 2 years ago. And that was also a very, very violent situation. There were actually 3 attempts to march. The first one was on what was called Bloody Sunday. They tried to cross the bridge. They were stopped by the police in Selma. I think 2 days later they started again, and that failed. And then 2 people had been killed, and that brought national attention to the entire event. And then about 2 weeks later, there were something like 25,000 people that completed the march from Selma to Montgomery, which actually happened. It was a 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, and it took about 5 days to complete that march. But there was another lady named, a white lady from Detroit, Viola Lutzo, I think it's Lutzo, who was killed by the Klan again, along with another person with a car. Was a black man that survived because he lay dead. But this brought national attention to that march from Selma to Montgomery, and then the thing that was really the culmination of that Selma march was the passage in 1965 of the Voting Rights Bill, and that's something, the Voting Rights Bill, so that you could no longer disqualify a person for voting for asking absolutely ridiculous questions. So it was very, very moving, and I simply wanted to point out, in my experience, having been on the march in Washington, what a contrast there was between that and everything we saw in Alabama.
Thank you. And I just wanted to read, this was before. Has created this against people of color and the criminal. Full of, there we go. And so that was kind of the setting for what we went into, and it was very, very profound. And so what I want to talk about, there's what Sophie alluded to or talked about earlier about the statue of the slaves being brought in, and then again over here the symbolism of the drowning and the incarceration. And so the lynching memorial is part of the 3 parts of the Legacy Museum. It is absolutely stunningly beautiful. It is a place of serenity, and yet it is a place that honors men and women and children who were killed through the only crime of being a person of color. And that juxtaposition is so, so difficult to put together. As Sophie said, there just all of these hanging markers that look like lynching, and sorry that one's on side, but they put all the names of people that they knew. But so often, if you can read sideways, it says unknown, 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 unknown. So many people that they don't even know the names of, they just know that they were lynched. Down in front, what looks like coffins are by state, people that have been discovered as being lynched after the memorial was made. And you can see the beautiful green grass, and it was so quiet and reverent. It was truly a holy place. There's just some more pictures of it, and down the third picture over were just some of the stories of why people were lynched. Well, you know, he looked at my daughter wrong. And so I was afraid for her. And so they were lynched. And sometimes they were lynched for walking on the wrong side of the street. And it was just amazing. The last picture over there is a waterfall. And on the waterfall, it says, thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror, lynchings whose deaths cannot be documented, many whose names will never be known. So that part of the memorial is honoring them. And it's just, all you hear is the fall of water as you walk by. There's just the beauty and the thoughtfulness that went into this is just overpowering. One of the things that it says is, for the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome. And so just walking through that and being there, I found that was the place where I was having these conversations with God, with what can we do? What can we here in Washington State do to, number one, make sure history is not repeated, but number two, to continue to fight the injustice for our brothers and sisters. And I know for myself, I gotta get out where'd my phone go? Here it is. I told somebody that I was going on this pilgrimage, and their remark to me shocked me, and I have to say I had no response. And what he said was, be careful on this pilgrimage. Remember, they really had it better than that, and most of them liked it. And it shocked me so profoundly that I had nothing to say back. And now I know I'm called to say something. One of the signs that we saw in one of the museums said, the colored people of our area actually have been the happiest of any others to be found anywhere. That was written in 1965. It's 2024. We've come a long way and we've gone nowhere. And so that was kind of the profound, that I took that into the pilgrimage, and I also exited with what I am called to do, and that is to stop that. We're kind of running out of time, but Sue is going to speak about the Maya Lin Civil Rights Memorial.
So the Maya Lin Memorial is located in Montgomery, Alabama. And of course, Maya Lin is noted particularly for the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. that was completed in 1982. And for anyone who's seen that, you know how powerful it is. She has also done 6 sites in along the Columbia River here in Washington and Oregon that is really worth seeing. But this memorial, and one of the pictures is sideways, it appears. It's located across the street from the Southern Poverty Law Center. and it honors the martyrs of the civil rights movement. It was dedicated in 1989. She took as her inspiration a line from King's I Have a Dream speech, which, of course, Clip was able to hear in Washington, D.C. It's from Amos, chapter 5, verse 24. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. There is a curved 40-foot long black granite wall that forms the backdrop with a thin sheet of water flowing over the wall with that inscription, the last part of it, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Now, in front of the wall is a circular black granite table with water flowing very thinly over it. It represents a timeline of the civil rights movement, and it's reminiscent of a sundial. It chronicles the major events of the civil rights movement and then names 40 individuals, men, women, and children, who died during the struggle. They were killed during the struggle. So it's easy for me to describe it. What's harder to convey is the feeling you get. You walk around clockwise and you trail your hand in the water around the edge. And yes, much of what we did, it was hard. I mean, you think you know the history. I'm telling you, we in Seattle do not really fully appreciate the history. But my takeaway as I walked around was, if anything represents hope and persistence, it's the civil rights movement. And that feeling is still very, very, very much in evidence. And for me, November was a very difficult month for me. And this is my big takeaway, is that feeling that, yes, we can continue to move forward. It's going to take all of us, but we need to continue moving forward in the way that we know we have to.
Thank you to Sherilyn, to all of the fellow pilgrims. It was a really profound experience, as you heard from everyone. And within 4 days, we got experiences that opened up our hearts and our minds and our bodies to a 10-year struggle and a 400-year history of brutality and oppression. And it was a profoundly visceral experience. As people said, the music was one of the balms that helped us, but importantly helped the people experiencing this horrific, horrific history where they were the objects of toxic hate and violence through custom and through law. It's incomprehensible. But the music was there for the leaders and the foot soldiers of this movement to keep them going in faith. And we, through the leadership of Arne, and who was a very gifted Grammy-nominated singer who leads a gospel choir in Los Angeles, she was able to help us understand the power of the music to keep the people going through the struggle going, and the combination of the faith that they experienced through the music. So I have a couple of the selections that I would love to play for you. We sang on the bus, and I didn't understand how powerful riding on a bus was and how integral, to the civil rights movement. But like, after going to the lynching museum, she let us wade in the water in this haunting song that she sang, and we joined in the traditional call and response of the gospel tradition. And after the lynching museum, we sang "There is a Balm in Gilead." And like, everyone's souls were in pain. And I had never, I know about the Fisk singers and the Jubilee singers, and listening to that from the comfort of your home in Seattle on a documentary is not the same as being there. And she complimented the singers in the bus because we had Julia and we had Mary and we had Clip and breaking out in harmony, and the courage that we felt by being welcomed to participate in that kind of singing really touched our souls. And so we gained the courage to sustain through this. And as y'all leave, I'm just going to play one thing that we worked on together, and kind of was this organic, beautiful thing that we did as our courage to sing and our realization of how important the music was came forward. Julie and I approached Arne and said, hey, can we do something extra? You know, can we sing in the evenings together? Can we do something? And Arne pondered it. She was really drained by leading us through this experience because it was, you know, very, very deep for her. And she said, well, I'll come back to you. And she came back to us and said, there's a song that was written to honor John Lewis, and when he got an honorary doctorate at Harvard a couple of years ago, and we're going to sing it. And she taught it to us in this beautiful way where she's like, okay, here's the melody, and then altos, you do this, and sopranos, you do that, and basses, you do that. And like she taught us through a very short session how to do it, and we performed it in Selma before walking over the bridge. And we performed it after hearing Joanne Bland, who had walked over the bridge at 8 years old. And we sang our hearts out under Arne's guidance. And at the end, and we marched around the room, you know, and it was this example of how the deep spiritual, okay, I'm going to get the hook, and I'm going to play it for you. But, you know, how it really kept people going through this struggle, and God talking to us, and healing the wounds, and processing the trauma. So maybe after Sherilyn raps, I'll play it.